Okay, I think we're going to get going. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Helena Andraco, and I'm on the board of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, otherwise known as LESPI. And I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to a program that I know you're really going to enjoy with our speaker, Thomas Rinaldi, author of New York Neon. Before we get into our program, I'd like to introduce the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative to those of you who aren't familiar with us. LESPI is a not-for-profit organization formed in 2007, whose mission is the preservation of the historic Lower East Side, which includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. We focus on advocating for the New York City Landmarks Commission to designate new historic districts and individual landmarks in the Lower East Side, which we do through meetings, submissions of requests for evaluation to the commission, and through outreach and education programs like our program this evening. So during our program, we invite you to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A section, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll hold off answering those questions until the end of the presentation, but then we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. So at this point, I'd like to turn our program over to Richard Moses, President of LESPI, to introduce our speaker. Richard?
Thank you, Helena, and hello, everybody. Really nice to see a good turnout tonight. And we're going to start by doing a quick poll. We want to see where everybody lives. Don't worry, the answers are anonymous, and it'll only take a minute or two. So here goes. Okay, I think we'll wrap up. Nice results, something along the lines of what we usually see. About a quarter of you are from the Lower East Side, which includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. So that's about a quarter, a little over half is from New York City outside of the Lower East Side. And then about 5% in the tri-state area outside of New York City, about 10% in the USA outside the tri-state area, another 5% outside the USA, which we always are excited to see. So that being done, let's see. I'm now very happy to introduce our speaker tonight, Tom Rinaldi. And Tom grew up in the Hudson River Valley near Poughkeepsie, New York. He's the author of New York Neon, Painted 1,000 Design Patents, and the co-author of the book, Hudson Valley Ruins, Forgotten Landmarks of an American Landscape. His photographs have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the New York Observer, CNN Online, and elsewhere, and have been exhibited at the New York State Museum at Albany and at the Municipal Art Society of New York. Tom holds degrees from Georgetown University and Columbia University and has worked for the National Park Service, the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and the Central Park Conservancy. He currently works as an architectural designer in New York City. So Tom, why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you very much, Richard and Helena, and thanks, LESPI, for having me, and thanks everyone for joining tonight. It's a rainy night in New York, so I feel a little less bad for having trapped people inside tonight, at least. But in any case, we'll start out. If I can get my screen, my slides to move. Tonight's program, as Richard mentioned, I had authored a book called New York Neon a few years back now, about a decade ago. And this talk is an outgrowth of that book. The subject of the book is historic neon storefront signs in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And historic, I set 1970 about as the cutoff date, because I found in looking at the signs that the aesthetic of the signs and the material of the signs really kind of changed in 1970, about 1970. For reasons we'll talk about a little bit in the program tonight. And again, in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Times Square spectaculars, as they were known, the big Times Square signs, like the famous Camel cigarette sign, had been written about and had been pretty well documented. But those were long gone. And when I was a kid frequenting the city coming in from upstate, I would see these storefront signs over bars and restaurants and old stores, and always kind of just loved them. But by the time I moved here, which was 20 years ago, they were dwindling in number, really kind of visibly. You could see them disappearing, and they were taking with them very often the kinds of independent businesses that they had advertised, those same old bars and restaurants and stores of various kinds of things. And so I started photographing them to kind of try and have something left of them, with this idea that they were going to be gone at some point. And over the course of a decade or so, photographed about 400 signs around the city. It really kind of canvassed the city, eventually made a kind of scientific process out of it, tracking them down and trying to leave no stone unturned over the course of throughout the 5 boroughs, trying to find these signs. And so this eventually grew into this book, New York Neon. The book and tonight's program both look at the signs themselves, but they also kind of look at the history of the subject. So tonight's program will have a section on the history, sort of a chapter on the history of the cultural history of neon, which is a fascinating history and one of the things that most interested me in the subject in the end. We'll have a second section that'll be looking at the technical history of the signs, like what are they, how do they work, and end with that, who made them, a little bit about the sign shops in New York that made these storefront signs. And then the last section of the talk will be sort of a portfolio. I also do walking tours and have done some walking tours with Lesby. I do a East Village walking tour and a West Village walking tour looking at neon signs. They're really kind of the last 2 neighborhoods in the city where there's enough of a concentration of these old storefront signs that you can really do a walking tour like that. And so the last section of the talk tonight will be a portfolio of signs on the Lower East Side and in the East Village. It'll be sort of a virtual walking tour. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions. We're going to try to do all of this in an hour, which is tough because it's a lot of ground to cover. I start this look at the cultural history of neon in sort of an unexpected place, which is a look at the career of the male actor in this slide. If we were all in a room together, I would ask for a show of hands of who could name this guy from looking at him, and then I would realize that his name's actually in the lower left of the slide, Dick Powell. And we'll look at 2 film clips featuring Dick Powell. Dick Powell featuring him and neon at different points in their respective careers. The first clip will be from a film called The Gold Diggers of 1933. We have about a 3-minute clip of this. You may need to adjust your volume. I apologize for the quality of the film clip's a little grainy, but here goes 3 minutes of The Gold Diggers of 1933, featuring Dick Powell and neon.
Shadows on the wall, I can see them fall here and there, everywhere. Silhouettes in blue, dancing in the dew. Here am I, where are you? In the shadows when I go and sing to you. In the shadows let me come and sing to you. Let me dream a song that I can bring to you. Song will be you. In the shadows when I come and sing to you. come and sing to you, dear, in the shadows when I come and sing.
Well, fast forward now almost exactly 10 years to Dick Powell and Neon depicted in another film called Murder My Sweet of 1944, depicted in a rather different way. So here's the second of our 3-minute film clips from Murder My Sweet featuring Dick Powell and Neon a decade later.
We're all set. The works? Yeah. Some of it you know. If I misquote you, let's get it on the record. From the beginning. With Malloy, then. Well, it was about 7 o'clock. Anyway, it was dark. What are you doing at the office that late? I'm a homing pigeon. I always come back to the stinking coop no matter how late it is. I've been out peeking under old Sunday sections for a barber named Dominic, whose wife wanted him back. I forget why. Only reason I took the job was because my bank account was trying to crawl under a duck. And I never found him. I just found out all over again how big this city is. My feet hurt, and my mind felt like a plumber's handkerchief. The office bottle hadn't sparked me up, so I'd taken out my little black book and decided to go grouse hunting. Nothing like soft shoulders to improve my morale. The soft shoulders had a date, but she thought she could do something about that. Was going to check right back. There's something about the dead silence of an office building at night. Not quite real. The traffic down below was something that didn't have anything to do with me. I seen your name on a blackboard downstairs. Yeah? I come up to see you. You're a private eye, huh? That's right. I like you to look for somebody. I'm closed up, pal. Come on tomorrow, we talk about it. I look for her where she worked. But I've been out of touch. Okay, tomorrow. I'd like to show you where she worked. Okay, you show me where she worked. This way. The joint looked like trouble, but that didn't bother me. Nothing bothered me. The 220s felt nice and snug against my appendix. I tried to picture him in love with somebody, but it didn't work.
And give you a second to readjust your volume. That's the last of the film clips, so hopefully the volume will be consistent for the rest of the talk. In any case, I found films were one of the most important resources for me in researching the cultural history of Neon, and one of the most fun places to be doing my research. And it was just sort of an interesting coincidence that one of the best depictions of Neon as it sort of came to be regarded in the film noir era happened to feature Dick Powell, and one of the best, if not the best depiction of Neon as it had been regarded and depicted in cinema and otherwise culturally in the early 1930s also happened to feature Dick Powell. And it was sort of a neat coincidence that their careers kind of paralleled each other in this interesting way from the early 1930s to the 1940s, going from something that was seen as very lily white to something a little grittier 10 years later. In fact, the interesting thing about the film Murder My Sweet is that it was one of the kind of archetypal classic noir films, is how it was later regarded, but based on, as many of these films were, based on a hard-boiled detective novel by Raymond Chandler called Farewell, My Lovely. And in making the film adaptation of the novel, the producers were so concerned about this film called Farewell, My Lovely, featuring Dick Powell, who in the 1930s had been known as a song and dance man, that they went to the length of changing the name of the film to Murder My Sweet to give it kind of a darker, more sinister overtone, so people wouldn't be confused about Dick Powell being in a very different kind of movie. Dick Powell was also sort of trying to shake his reputation as this song and dance man. So the two of them had their sort of reputations changed in this kind of interesting way, as we'll see a little bit why and how that happened through the course of the 1930s. Neon had been around in the backdrop in New York as part of a character-defining feature of the streetscapes of New York City for the middle 20th century decades, in the backdrop of scenes like this author photo of Jack Kerouac on the upper part of the slide, this view of Sugar Ray's in Harlem from about 1950, in the backdrop of news photos of riots happening uptown in the 1960s, the Stonewall riot in Greenwich Village in 1969. There in the backdrop of this photo of the filming of the 7-Year Itch in Midtown, and there in the backdrop of a news photo of the 23rd Street fire, the infamous 23rd Street fire, the deadliest fire in the history of the New York City Fire Department until 9/11. Just sort of there as something that we sort of took for granted until it really kind of, as I said, started to disappear. And then in the early 2000s is when I went out trying to find what was left of these places. And they turned out very often to be some of the most kind of interesting and sort of dyed-in-the-wool neighborhood anchors that you'd find in any of their respective neighborhoods. In New York, this was a place called the Subway Inn that was up across from Bloomingdale's on East 60th Street. That was just a great dive bar that unfortunately is no longer there. They did move a few blocks over and I think are still open and managed to take their sign with them. So this sign sort of still exists a few blocks over on the Upper East Side. Looking at the evolution of neon and the technical aspects of it, these signs work basically, you can think of neon tubes as kind of custom-made light bulbs in a sense. They're not light bulbs in the incandescent sense. They're a mode of electric illumination known as luminous tube lighting. And the way it works is you take a glass tube and hermetically seal it, pump it with a gas, which is not always neon. It's in fact as often argon gas as it is neon gas. Neon is almost a kind of generic term for these signs. Anytime you see a sign that's red, it's probably neon. If it's any color other than red, it's probably argon. Helium has also been used as well. And then you introduce an electrical current at one end of the tube and give the electrical current a way out at the other end of the tube by way of electrodes. And in the process of arcing basically from one electrode to the other, the electrical current excites the gas that's pumped inside the tube, causing it to glow. And that's how a neon tube works. The father of this technology is often thought of as this man, a Frenchman called Georges Claude, who will unfortunately forever go down in history for having been a Nazi sympathizer during the Second World War. But before that, Claude was a scientist and entrepreneur whose company called Air Liquide actually still exists. Their business was to find commercial uses for gases that had been identified by being isolated from the atmosphere. Neon wasn't invented, it was discovered. The way helium and argon and various other gases were discovered, we're actually all breathing trace amounts of neon that exist in the atmosphere right now. And the process, well, the technology of luminous tube lighting actually predated the discovery of neon. This is an illustration of something called a Geisler tube, which was kind of a novelty device that existed in the mid-19th century. There were other experiments with luminous tube lighting that went back even into the 17th century. But it was really, in my research, I came to find this man here, a scientist called D. McFarland Moore, who was an associate of Thomas Edison, who in the 1880s and 90s was really kind of pioneering this research into luminous tube lighting as an alternative to incandescent lighting, which Thomas Edison, of course, basically invented. But as we all know, incandescent bulbs give off a lot of their energy inefficiently in the form of heat rather than light, and so inefficient that at this point you basically can't get them anymore. But Moore was looking at more efficient forms of lighting and exploring this alternate mode of luminous tube lighting. his problem was he was doing this before neon had been discovered. So he was using any other kind of gas he could get his hands on. And typically these gases didn't work as efficiently as neon. But it didn't stop him from achieving a certain degree of success with this in the 1890s. This is an interesting photograph of the lobby of Stanford White's Madison Square Garden on Madison Square in New York, with an installation of more tube lights lighting the lobby. They were installed in other places, like the old post office down by City Hall had them. And they were also used for electric signs in the same period. They were reportedly somewhat common, although I've had a very hard time finding photographs. One of the only photographs I could find of a more tube sign that would have existed in New York circa 1900. Neon gas, in the meantime, wasn't invented for a few more years. So typically electric signs of this period were using incandescent light bulbs. And this is an illustration from a pattern book for different sign designs using incandescent bulbs. Incandescent bulb signs had started to appear in New York and other cities in the 1890s. And you can imagine that these were somewhat problematic, very high maintenance, the bulbs burning out constantly, using a lot of electricity, you having to constantly be monitoring these things to replace burned out bulbs, et cetera. So luminous tube lighting was really sort of ripe for this use for electric signs. Neon gas was discovered by these two men, Sir William Ramsay and Morris Travers, in England in 1897. And what they did basically was distill it from the atmosphere. Their process was to cool air until it turned into a liquid. And then as the liquid turned back into a gas, the different component gases of the atmosphere would turn back into a gas individually. And in the course of doing this, they were able to isolate the different gases. So neon was a gas that they isolated in 1897. And their process of doing this, one of the first things they would do with the newly isolated gas to start to assess its different properties would be to isolate it in a glass tube and run an electrical current through it. Well, when they did this with neon, the result was, of course, that it gave off this bright red glow. So this was, very interesting. Not all that useful to someone like D. McFarlane Moore, who was looking to come up with a practical alternative to incandescent light bulbs for interior lighting, this red light. I mean, there's only so much you could do with the red light. Well, it was Claude who eventually figured out that one thing you could do with this was make signs. And so in the years right before World War I, Claude's company began marketing this development for outdoor electrical signs. And basically what they did was they actually literally took a Moore tube and pumped it with neon gas, which they had access to and Moore didn't really have ready access to. And they took the idea and just ran with it from there. The earliest photos of neon signs date to the period right before World War I. This is a photograph that I found that was really fascinating to me. When I found it, it was a photo from about 1913 of a London West End theater, illuminated with an electric sign, and also this kind of architectural use of neon tubes outlining this arch here. That architectural use of neon in its early years was somewhat widespread. More photos have surfaced in the last few years of earlier installations of neon. This is a photo that I imagine must have had to be hand-colored in some way, but this shows one of the first installations of neon in an architectural manner before World War I in Paris. There's a number of photos from the series that you can find online nowadays. Here's a photo of one of the earliest neon advertising signs, also in Paris in the years around World War I. World War I, of course, put a hold on this, but after the war, the business really kind of exploded, and it was the years right after World War I when you started to see the first neon signs show up here in the United States. There were some antecedents of these, arguably. There's all kinds of research into trying to figure out, well, where was the first neon sign in the United States? The common wisdom is that it was this sign or one of several signs very much like this sign that were installed for a California Packard dealer, either in Oakland or Los Angeles or both. But in any case, this is sort of a good detail photograph of what those earliest neon signs were looking like in the years right after World War I. Here's an image of two of the earliest neon signs to appear in New York City. You can see in this advertisement on the right, Claude Neon Lights Incorporated. This was George Claude's company, having set up shop in New York after World War I. This is a sign on the left for Loft Candies, which was a big chain in New York at the time and well into the middle 20th century. The sign on the right for Overland, which became Willys Overland, one of the most important automakers in the U.S. In the years between World War I and World War II. So here are these were probably window signs, the signs pictured here, but here are some of the very earliest signs in New York. This is a display ad for Claude Neon Lights from the late 1920s, giving you a sense for what these signs were looking like in those years. And here again, if we were all in a room, I would say, can anyone identify or figure out what's one thing that all the signs in this picture have in common? And it's probably something that would not occur to most people off the bat. So I'll give away the answer, which is that most of the signs in this slide gathered here are advertising big corporations, chain businesses, Willys Overland, a car maker, Ever-Ready Batteries, John Ward Men's Shoes. The shoe retail chains loved neon in its earliest years, interestingly. Ford automobiles, etc. And this is an indication, and something that I thought was quite interesting, of neon in its earliest years being something that was really kind of expensive. This was not something that just the average mom and pop shop could install over their storefront. So the earliest neon signs were really kind of something that was exclusive, something you needed to have a lot of money to be able to install. And that was sort of part of their character and part of the way they were understood in the earliest years. Claude Neon attempted to maintain a monopoly on the business through the 1920s. There were what became known as the patent wars, the neon wars of the 1920s. American Neon, Rainbow Light Incorporated. And here are some news clippings from that period, sort of covering this battle that was going on between these different companies. But by the early 1930s, Claude's patents expired. Any company could get into the business that wanted to. And it was in these years, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, especially after 1932 or so, that neon just kind of exploded and turned up all over the place. I really sort of found in my research that 1933 was kind of the peak year for neon. This is the year of Gold Diggers of 1933, which was not the only film to depict neon in that kind of glamorous way. There's a film called Dames, 1934, a great film called Hollywood Party, which has this scene of telephone operators with a neon telephone switchboard in front of them, connecting people's calls. This was also the year of the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. Now, we would sort of quickly assume that neon was really, having its best moment at the time of the famous 1939 World's Fair of New York, that sort of iconic episode in the history of Art Deco. But I found that, in fact, neon's real high point came in about 1933. The Chicago World's Fair actually gave demonstrations of neon glass bending. Neon is often talked about in linear feet. So how many linear feet, for example, in sort of touting what a extravagant sign, a particular sign might be, the sign maker might publicize how many feet of neon tubing went into making this particular sign. Well, the Chicago 1933 World's Fair, I had to look up in my book last night, had an estimated 44,000 linear feet, which works out to about 7.5 miles of neon tubing. So it was a real sort of feature of the fair. It was seen in these years as an icon of modernity, of all that was sort of streamlined and clean, and the best of the aesthetic of developing cities of the period, and depicted in various works of art in that way. But fast forward a few years later, and what people came to find was that these signs had really kind of gone a little too far. And I found literature from the late 1930s of people starting to complain about these signs running like rivers of red down the commercial streets of every city and town across the country. It wasn't just big cities, but here's an image of the main drag in Cascade, Iowa, taken in 1944. And it's incredible how these signs really kind of came to aesthetically be character-defining features of commercial strips across the country and around the world in the 1930s. A couple of developments came along in the late 1930s that started to erode neon's place in the landscape. And one was the introduction by General Electric of the fluorescent tube light in 1938, here portrayed by this model that General Electric put on a magazine cover. So this was 1938. No sooner was this introduced that General Electric began promoting fluorescent tube lights like this for use in advertising signs. And so here was an illustration from some GE promotional literature from the late 1930s, showing how sign makers could use these fluorescent tube lights in these kind of panel signs like this. Now, if you look really closely at this image, you'll see that the sign faces themselves here are being made out of glass, which you could see would be sort of impractical and have certain problematic aspects to it, namely how fragile it is. Kids could throw a rock at it, very easily damaged. Well, that problem was solved at the exact same time by the advent of plexiglass, which became commercially available in 1936, marketed by a Philadelphia company called Rahm & Haas. And the two of these things together started to almost immediately make inroads in neon's share of sign business, beginning even before World War II, which was sort of a revelation to me. We sort of think of this as something that happened a bit later. These are the signs that corporate America kind of turned to in the years after World War II. These fluorescent tube-lit, plexiglass-faced signs that became, typical at every gas station, et cetera, after the war. And the effect this had on neon was that it left neon, instead of being the signage of choice for big corporations, here's a sort of typical plexiglass-faced sign that you'll see around the cities today. Neon was left to more questionable kinds of businesses, taxi dance halls, liquor stores, et cetera, and began to be associated with the kinds of businesses where you didn't necessarily know what you were going to get. And again, not just in New York City, but another cinematic depiction of roadside neon and its association with questionable businesses. This was a great example of this, no better example, a sign that was on 8th Avenue at about 44th Street, just off of Times Square, until very, very recently. This just disappeared about 6 months ago, maybe even less than that. So after that juxtaposition of Dick Powell in neon from The Gold Diggers of 33 to Murder My Sweet in 1944, this is maybe the next best image that I came up with in juxtaposing this this cultural regard for neon versus what succeeded it. I mean, this is that magazine cover from General Electric in 1940, contrasted with the way neon was being depicted around the same time or a few years later. The Neon Wilderness, I think, was a collection of short stories published in about 1947, with some great references to neon in the text that I was able to quote in my own book. Here were a few more book covers. Here's a cover from a later edition of Farewell, My Lovely, the Raymond Chandler novel that the film clip we saw before was based on. And you'll see that bar sign with its flickering lights that was shown in the film clip, and in fact vividly described in the text of the book, is actually even shown on the cover here. Another book about a male hustler in Times Square, published by John Ritchie, also featuring neon on its cover, but also in the text of the book itself. Jack Kerouac's On the Road had lots of references to neon in it as well. So neon is kind of on the outs. After riding high in the early 1930s, by the 40s, it's the stuff of film noir. And as I said for the book, I watched a lot of noir films. And when I was really in the thick of writing this book, I was watching at least one a night, night after night after night. And it starts to kind of change the way you look at the world when you watch these movies over and over and over again. Fun to watch, but a little dark. This is a lap fade sequence, a still from a lap fade sequence from a film called Black Angel of 1946, starring, I think, Dan Duryea. And here's the look on his face with, probably neon lights sort of, refracting off of the sweat in this image. Probably the best depiction of this in a single film is in the 1946 Frank Capra film, It's a Wonderful Life. This is the film that George Bailey, the Welcome to Bedford Falls sign that George Bailey was used to seeing. And here's the sign he encounters in the alternate reality sequence of the film when he's walking into Pottersville. And a minute or two later, he's got this look of absolute horror on his face as these signs are kind of flashing around him. This kind of coincided with, at the same time, there'd been sort of long-held misgivings about outdoor advertising generally, electric or not. And in my book, I get a little bit into the history of the anti-sign movements that have existed. These culminated in the 1960s with the highway beautification program. But before the highway beautification program, there was this book, God's Own Junkyard, by the architect Peter Blake, in which scenes of what you would consider the ideal were contrasted with the opposite. And the opposite, of course, features neon very prominently. This, at the same time, though, a roundabout way gave neon a sort of an appeal that I describe as the bohemian mystique. And here is this author photo of Jack Kerouac again, in a place that some people will surely recognize immediately. This is Grove Street in Greenwich Village, a photo from, I believe, 1957, and a rare instance of these signs are still there. The Arthur's Tavern sign over his right shoulder, the Marie's Crisis sign over his left shoulder are both still there. Neither of them has lit up in years. I would love to see them restored. Probably more likely they'll disappear, unfortunately, but this is just a really neat photo. So besides that bohemian mystique, there was at the same time this newfound appreciation for neon and other similar kinds of things as being kind of roadside Americana. And this came from high art and kind of, went on down from there. But you had something like Ed Richet's 26 gasoline station from the early 1960s. Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi's book, Learning from Las Vegas, 1972. Rudy Stern, Let There Be Neon, 1979, a book that specifically celebrated neon and its place in the landscape and its history. Rudy Stern's shop, Let There Be Neon, still exists here in Tribeca in New York City. The End of the Road by John Margolis, 1981, was a celebration of gas stations and other, kinds of commercial archaeology. The Society for Commercial Archaeology formed around that same time, and neon and other sorts of elements of the commercial landscape featured in Chester Leaves's book, Main Street to Miracle Mile of 1985. So there's a little history of neon and its highs and its lows through the years. A look now at sort of the process and where these signs came from. If there was one sign shop in New York that people probably could name, if asked to name a sign shop, it would probably have been this sign shop, the Art Crafts Strauss Company. This is a building that I'm sure some of you will recognize that was a very prominent landmark over on the West Side Highway at the foot of West 57th Street for years and years and years. It disappeared not all that long ago, but it's sort of, if you go to that corner now, and the very modern buildings that took the place of this, it's hard to imagine that anything like this could have been there in recent memory. And yet it was. But this was the sign shop, the biggest of the New York sign shops that made the great big Times Square spectaculars, the camel sign, et cetera, for most of the mid-century decades. And they were in business up through the 90s and maybe even in the early 2000s. They actually still exist as a consulting business, I believe, but no longer make signs. They did make some smaller storefront signs, but the storefront signs, advertising restaurants and other little businesses, after the Claude Neon patents expired in the early 1930s, most of these signs were made by smaller companies, and there were dozens of these little companies around the city in all 5 boroughs. And here are some display ads from the yellow pages that I found for these businesses. And these advertisements became a great sort of research resource in and of themselves. They'd say, when the business, in some cases, we've been in business since such and such a year, et cetera. But also they're kind of just beautiful to look at. Here were some other clues as to who had made these signs. In photographing them, I would notice these little maker's plaques tucked into the little corners here and there. And I, at some point, decided I'd better start photographing these too, and wound up making a great big spreadsheet in which I tried to correlate which signs were made by which companies. But when I started to make contact with people in the neon business in New York, it was hard to find old timers, but I did manage to find some who could tell me a little bit about, who ran these businesses, et cetera. So these sign shops typically would have 3 divisions to them: the art department, the sheet metal department, and the neon department. The design of the signs, in some cases, would come from an architect or a professional designer. And here's an architectural drawing for one of those chain shoe storefronts. This is by an architect called Vahan Hagopian from about 1933 or so. And so here's a design professional who's working with neon as an architectural material almost, like any other. But typically, the designs for these signs were not coming from design professionals as such. They were coming from sign painters who were members in New York City. In these New York City sign shops, the sign painters were members of the Sign Painters Union, and they staffed what was known as the art department in these various smaller neon shops around the city, which would maybe employ, say, 15 people, 10 to 20 people. This is an image from a pattern book for sign designers, one of a handful of such books that were published, kind of giving you an idea of where a sign painter might find inspiration for a sign for a particular kind of business, whether it be something like a teaspoon or packaging. There were books published for sign painters, books of different alphabets, of different letter forms. And here are some pages from one such book. They're neat books. They're very, very hard to find today. Some of these letter forms in these books would be specifically intended for use in neon. This is a page from one of these pattern books with a couple of typical examples. One of my great discoveries was meeting the man whose family business had made a sign that may be familiar to some people. This is the sign for the Papaya King, which existed until quite recently, but unfortunately no more, up on 3rd Avenue and East 86th Street. And Justin had still the whole project folder for the making of this sign, which was installed in 1964. And this is a sketch that kind of gives you an idea for how the design of one of these signs would come together. And here, this was a sketch probably by his father, figuring out how many feet, how many inches of different tubes were going to be needed to render this design. Here's an approved design sketch. Here's a more formal drawing that was made for that sign. And this would have been quite typical for the drawings that were used to make a lot of these storefront signs around the city. And here's Justin standing in front of that sign about 10 years ago or so. The sign, I am told, was salvaged somewhat and is at one of the architectural salvage operations here in New York City for an exorbitant price. But at least that means it has a chance of being preserved somehow. The building's been knocked down. The business moved across the street, but to a space that was much smaller and didn't have room for the sign. From the art department, the project would move to the sheet metal department of a sign shop. And if you look at these signs and sort of take a step back from them, look at them in the daylight, you'll notice that even more than the neon tubing, the sort of critical part of them is this sheet metal component. There'll be like a metal armature that has a sheet metal box built around it. And so these sheet metal workers, who are members of the Metal Workers Union, would staff this sort of second part of the process for making these signs. And here's a sketch of kind of how that sheet metal box, typical of these signs, would come together. That sort of metal component of these signs went back way before neon became a part of these signs. It was seen as advantageous, less likely to catch fire, even in the days of incandescent bulb signs. Here's a typical sign from the early 20th century. Earlier on, these signs tended to be influenced by more kind of classical kinds of design. So there were these little moldings that were available that were marketed to sign makers that could be added onto the signs. One of the older surviving neon signs in New York, and one of the just my favorites, is the Nathan's Famous sign out in Coney Island. The oldest of their signs there has some of these moldings on it. It may even be these exact moldings that you see here on the left. The form of the boxes that the signs that the neon would be mounted to were in some cases so distinctive that I often say you could recognize the sign even without the lettering being on it. Here are some sketches that I made of silhouettes of different signs around New York City with the lettering removed. So it's kind of a testament to the role of these sheet metal workers in the bigger picture of these signs. But of course, the quintessential part is the neon itself. And so these sign shops would have the art department, the sheet metal department, and the glass department, or the neon department, or the electrical department. And this was staffed by members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the IBEW. So an interesting aspect to the business. A little known fact was that most of the neon tubing in this country was actually made by Corning in upstate New York for many years in the 20th century, better known for their dishware. There were schools for neon glass benders. There was one, this is one that operated in New York. The sort of high point of these sort of training institutes was the years after World War II, where you could use GI Bill funding to attend them, and many people did. It was a burgeoning business after World War II. This is a illustration of do's and don'ts for bending neon glass tubes, with a plan drawing of a typical neon glass bender's workbench, which would have different kinds of torches on it, which were specialized for different kinds of bends that you'd make in the glass. Here's another drawing showing the ribbon burner, the crossfire, and the cannon fire, sort of less common. The ribbon burner and the crossfire, I think the two most common kinds of these. We'll see some pictures of them later. Off to one end of the workbench, you'd have a pump and bombarder, which was used to bombard the formed, once you had the tube formed from the fires, from those torches, you would purify it, clean it out by bombarding it with a very high electrical charge, which would have the effect of basically frying out any kind of impurity. The glass tube would then be vacuumed out and then pumped with whether it be neon or argon, depending on what color the tube was supposed to be, and then sealed up and ready to be installed in the sign. So here are some photos of the process. This is Todd Swarmstead out at the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, showing off some glass from his stock. This was a glass bender I met called Omar, who worked up at Latera Signs in the Bronx. And you can see here he's just lighting up the crossfires to do some work. This is Robbie Inouye out at Artistic Neon, which is still in business in Ridgewood, Queens. Second generation, Robbie's second generation in the business. Here he is with the ribbon burner in use. Here's Omar again at the bombarding station. And this is the byproduct, window signs here. Window signs were, even as the storefront signs were disappearing, were all over the place and were a lot of fun to photograph. But these two are disappearing these days because of LEDs. This is a dramatic installation that was up by Times Square, gone now, of a giant LED sign. Here was another one that was across from Penn Station. But more typically, LEDs have kind of taken this form. This is a broken Duane Reade sign where you can see that behind these plexiglass faces, where what would have been in a sign like this, neon, until say 10 years ago or so, which was a lot of business for the neon glass vendors, and still meant that there was a lot of work for these people in sign shops in New York, kind of subtly and quietly became LED. And so you have, as a result of this, far fewer people doing neon now than you did just a few years ago. Here's a broken open sign, sort of revealing its LEDs but meant to look like neon, interestingly. And now the last part of the talk, a sort of virtual tour of neon signs on the Lower East Side and the East Village. As I said, one of the last neighborhoods in the city where you can, have a dense enough concentration of these signs to be able to do such a tour. This is one of my favorites. It's a little bit off the beaten path. This is at Attorney Street and East Houston Street, the Parkside Bar, which is a nice, quiet little spot, a little off the beaten path. So this, on my actual walking tours, we don't get over here, but it's just a fantastic, intact example of a vertical sign and a horizontal sign. The materiality, if we were on a walking tour, I could point to the use of stainless steel, which was kind of the classic sheet metal for many of the New York signs in the 1950s. The vertical sign using porcelain enameled steel in combination with stainless, which kind of is another part of the aesthetic of these signs. By the late 1960s, these kinds of metals were replaced with aluminum. And anodized aluminum, which had become commercially available at that point, to the point that it was a viable successor, cheaper alternative to these metals, which contributed to the change of the aesthetic of the signs. This is a sign that existed. I don't think it's there anymore. A little west of there, down on Houston Street. I'm not sure what's in the storefront now. Had been for years the bar called Meow Mix. This is still there, thank God, on 2nd Avenue and East 6th Street in the Village, Block Drugs. In photographing these signs, if there was one in a corner, that was definitely the one I'd be most excited to shoot, because you get 2 facades for the price of one. This is kind of an interesting storefront in that you'll note right at the corner, it says established 1885. And this I found over and over and over again. You had these businesses that were very, very old businesses. So though the sign was old, this is a sign that, as near as I could tell, dates to 1945. The business was even older. Some of the most venerable businesses in the city. In the West Village, there's Bigelow Drugs, which claims to be the oldest continuously operating drugstore in the United States, founded in 1837 or something. And its sign is also a neon sign from about the same period that has its founding date of 1837 advertised in neon. So kind of an interesting thing that these were hallmarks of the oldest businesses in town. Neon crosses, interestingly enough, neon, of course, exploding on the scene in the 1920s. Well, what was going on in the United States in the 1920s? Prohibition. So before you had neon bar signs and neon liquor store signs in the United States, you had neon crucifixes. And there were quite a few neon crucifixes in New York as early as the 1920s. This one's not quite that old, but this is a favorite from the Father's Heart Ministries on East 11th Street, which I believe is still there. Here's another one. So you have 2 neon crucifixes in the East Village. This is the Orthodox Cathedral of the Holy Virgin of Protection on East 2nd Street. A photograph I got of it before it stopped lighting up. It's still there, but I haven't seen it. As far as I know, it's still there. It hasn't lit up in years, though, unfortunately. This one's still there and still lights up. This is a favorite sign of a favorite business. And of course, in doing this project, I made every effort to speak to the people who actually own these signs and who are responsible for their care. And in doing so, met some interesting people, had some hits and some misses. But one of the great hits was the family that runs the Viniero Pasticceria, another business that, as you can see here, has been around since 1894. So a very old business. Its sign is from probably about 1945. Again, needs some restoration, but they're still lighting it up every night, and they couldn't have been friendlier or nicer. So you have a really great sort of feeling every time I see Vinieros. This is a sign around the corner from them that's unfortunately gone. The business, I think, managed to sort of re-embody itself and move to New Jersey, as has happened with a number of these independent businesses. This was Diriberti's or Diribertis. We could take a poll on what the correct pronunciation of this place was for some of you locals. But this is a business that was, I believe, First Avenue, just around the corner from Viniero's. The interior of this pastry shop was, older than the sign, probably hadn't changed since the 1920s or so. And last I knew, the interior of this business on First Avenue, just below 11th Street, I think, was intact and housing another business of some kind. Here's one that's still there, Russ and Daughter on Houston Street. And a favorite for its little fish. And when I do the tour, I use this sign to kind of point out the aesthetic of these signs in New York tends to be pretty simple. You don't see a lot of figural neon, figural being something like this little fish. In New York, you have great what I call pre-Helvetica letter forms used for these signs. But now some of the earlier signs in New York would do more in the way of little frills like the little fish, or if you know, on the in Greenwich Village on the west side, Monty's restaurant has a little chef with a plate of steaming food. But this to me was an indication of how expensive it was. A few things: how expensive it was to make these signs, particularly in New York, where the sign shops had to be staffed by members of 3 different unions. So in the 1950s, on say Route 66, you'd have these more extravagant signs with the motel with the woman diving into the swimming pool or something in animated neon on the sign. By the 1950s in New York, the signs were generally pretty simple. But you also, of course, would have less space to make such an extravagant sign if you're installing something on a city street. But I think it was also kind of a sign of the sort of move from urban to suburban, and from downtown streets to more kind of Miracle Mile kinds of contexts, and the flow of commerce in that direction. That the more extravagant kinds of signs in the 1950s were tending to be found on those more kind of suburban and highway sort of contexts. Here's a detail of the Russ and Daughters fish. Down the street from Russ and Daughters, another of the oldest, most venerable, iconic commercial institutions in the city that, of course, advertises itself with a sign like this, Katz's Delicatessen, which I believe opened up in 1888. The sign from the 1930s, in this case. Great window signs at Katz's too. Gringer's, another old business from 1918. Gringer's sign installed, I think 1953 was the installation date I had for this. It was beautifully restored by the aforementioned Let There Be Neon a few years ago, and is still lighting up on First Avenue today. Here's a sign for John's Italian Restaurant, a little further up, closer to 14th Street. This is the sign as I first photographed it. The sign was redone, but is still there, looking like this a few years ago. And John's still there, still great as far as I know. Here's one of my favorites, taken a few years ago when Stomp was still in its like 50,000 performance residency at the Orpheum Theater on 2nd Avenue. A neat old theater. Stomp has since closed. A few other things have gone into this theater since then. I don't know if there's anything showing there now. This marquee, originally in their historic photos, showing that this marquee once had 3 faces. Now the north face is the only one that survives. It's a great example of what was a common typology for the sheet metal being used for these signs, which was that it had these raised letters like this, which was a harkening back to wooden signs that were made earlier. This is a building that is not landmarked, and I don't know, maybe in the comments afterwards, if anyone's ever really tried to get this building landmarked, it would be great to have some hope that this thing will survive in the long term. But in the meantime, it's one of the very few neon movie theater marquees that's left anywhere in New York. Here's a business that we lost, unfortunately, somewhat recently. A long, sad story, Theater 80 St. Mark's on St. Mark's Place. A daytime photo showing off its sheet metal box. Distinctive shape. One of the best anywhere in the city is this one that disappeared right after I started taking photos. And this is when I walked by and it was flickering, kind of like that flickering sign in Murder My Sweet. And sometimes I would think, oh, I'll come back and I'll let them fix it and I'll come back and get a better picture and not bother to photograph it. Well, I'm really glad I bothered to photograph this one, even though it wasn't lighting up all the way, because I don't think it was ever fixed before it disappeared. This business had sort of a tragic end as well, but it had great signs. Here's a chow mein sign. The signs were saved, sort of. I wound up by chance meeting an antiques dealer who had literally pulled this out of a scrap pile. The contractor who was removing the signs had done this to them and sent them off to scrap. And if I have the story right, it's some years ago. I think this antiques dealer actually had to go to the scrap yard and pull it out of the pile. And this is what was left of it. And they were interested in restoring it, but it was a daunting proposition. And I don't know if they ever succeeded. And it was possible. Certainly something that could be done. I don't know if they ever succeeded in doing it. The fascia sign advertising Jade Mountain Restaurant over the storefront was in a little bit better shape. And I understand these have turned up somewhere recently. I'm not sure where, but still around, hopefully. So what to take away from all this? What's the meaning of these signs? I mean, people love them, but people have also hated them through the years. This is a sign that had advertised the Holland Bar and Restaurant, which was in the Holland Hotel on 42nd Street. It lost its space. It found a new space around the corner. They didn't have room for the sign outside, so they moved it inside over the bar. And to me, it was an indication of the sort of regard that people have for these signs. I mean, Neon had that high moment in the early 30s and that low moment decades later. Neon is banned from certain places, but this is a business that really bent over backwards to hold on to their sign. And in fact, between the letters O and L in Holland, you can just make out an urn where one of the longtime patrons of this establishment decided he liked to have his eternal resting place. Unfortunately, the business has closed again, so I don't know where the sign or where the urn are these days. Hopefully still around somewhere. But these signs sort of figured into, as I was photographing them, a larger dialogue that was taking place in New York about the way the city was changing and the disappearance of a lot of these venerable kinds of businesses, blogs, different books published. My book was not the only book published that really kind of started looking at this subject in the last 15 years or so. And what I came to kind of conclude about these signs, here's one of the best ones that disappeared, unfortunately, from the Upper West Side. What I came to conclude about these signs was that their value overall was for providing contrast in the landscape. Contrast between, there's various ways that contrast can be an element of a streetscape between big and small, rich and poor, new and old. And so, we live in a situation where, of course, not all of these signs were going to survive, but where they do survive, they really, really stand out. Whereas when they were new, they were garden variety. There were too many of them. People complained about how many of them there were. And from there, we've come to a point where they exist, they do exactly what they were meant to do, which was catch your attention and stand out. New York is a city that's always been changing. So, complaining about New York changing is seems to be kind of a crazy thing. This is an illustration of, from the early boom years of skyscraper construction, that was sort of a political cartoon, as if to say, well, if we keep building like this, what are we going to be stuck with here? But New York, as I said, has always been a place of change. And so you can only, resist change in the landscape, but so much. But that same sort of process of change is what fascinated photographers and different artists. Here's a photograph by Bernie Sabat, a sort of typical photograph from the 1930s, contrasting this old elevated subway structure with what would then have been the brand new McGraw-Hill building down on 42nd Street. And so you need sort of an element of that kind of contrast in the city, and change kind of gives you that contrast, but you at the same time don't want to have things changing to such a crazy degree that you lose everything old. So trying to find that right balance is sort of the thing to reflect on. And what I found to be sort of the takeaway, the thing that was most meaningful about these signs, if that makes any sense. And if it doesn't, we have a few minutes for questions, and maybe I can attempt to make some more sense. But with that, I thank you very much. And I think we still have some time for questions.
Tom, thank you so much. Yeah, we have time. We have a few questions, a couple of questions in there. I want to mention the kind of very brief discussion we had before the webinar started about how to save these signs even on landmark buildings, and that the Landmarks Commission, when it's dealing with a landmark building that has signage that's kind of a contributing feature to the historic character of the building, will actually not protect the sign itself, but will protect the existence of a sign, and will insist that if the sign is changed, that the aesthetic of the new sign kind of reflects the aesthetic of the old sign. But meanwhile, you'll have landmark buildings where, as you pointed out, Tom, that the terracotta masonry needs to be replaced with new terracotta masonry if it's falling apart. But the neon signage is not looked at something that as a material is an important artifact and an aesthetic feature in its own right. So, it's a tricky situation, but losing these things is terrible. Especially since it's become so rare, and then you just keep seeing them, drop away over time. So it's not a reassuring feature. But this brings us to one of the questions that we have here, that Jill writes about. Do you know of any museums that have taken an interest in this subject and have preserved examples for an exhibit or their collection?
Yes, the short answer is yes. For many years, there was no museum of this kind anywhere near New York. There was a neon museum in Philadelphia that's kind of been an on again, off again, and is currently off again operation. The best of these is the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, which is not a neon museum as such. It's a sign museum, and they preserve all different kinds of signs. They have a great archive as well, where they preserve some of those pattern books that we saw some slides of. And they loaned materials to me for my research and for the book. They have managed to take under their wing a number of New York City signs, probably most notably, if anyone remembers, the Clover Deli sign that was on 34th Street and 2nd Avenue from the 1950s up until about 2 years ago. That was put on a trailer and trucked out to Cincinnati and has been restored and is now on display at the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, one of a couple New York signs that's there. Los Angeles has the Museum of Neon Art, which is not a sign museum per se, but is a neon museum. They have a lot of neon signs, but it's a museum of neon art, so it's neon art as well. More and more of these have popped up. Las Vegas, of course, has one. A number of cities around the world have started neon museums. I think there's one in Lisbon. I think Berlin has one. I think Edmonton has one in Canada. And now there's a sign museum of New York that's started in recent years in Brooklyn, and they've been gathering, again, not neon per se, all different kinds of signs. I think they have some neon. But so, yes, there are a number of museums around. Instagram is a great place to kind of start going down the rabbit hole and finding these places. I mean, you could Google it as well, but there's a number of places you can start.
Well, thanks. And Eileen just mentions, thanks so much for doing this informative, enjoyable presentation. So enjoying seeing this amazing neon signage I so miss. Mitchell points out that the Pepsi sign in Long Island City is landmarked, which is true. But I think if they wanted to change that out to, say, Coca-Cola or, even General Motors, I'm not sure how that would work. From my experience, including when the RCA building became the GE building, I think in Rockefeller Center, they didn't make them advertise something that was no longer being sponsored by the building.
Yeah,
So,
that's the approach that's been taken by the New York City Landmarks Commission. And they had sort of a fine line to walk legally. And I think that, you know, in consultation with lawyers, that's where they landed on what their approach was going to be. When I did the book, there was no sign in New York that was a designated landmark in its own right. The Pepsi sign became the first sign in New York, and I think is still the only sign in New York that's landmarked as a sign. But as you said, Richard, exactly that. It's landmarked in this kind of funny way that if Pepsi decided they didn't want to foot the bill for this thing anymore, and Coca-Cola did, it could become a Coke sign, or it could become a sign for anything else. And the 30 Rock sign is a great example of that. The sign wasn't landmarked as such, but the building was. And that sign is now, and it's probably third or fourth different iteration since the building was landmarked. It was switched over to Comcast a few years ago from it had been the GE sign and RCA before that. It's now LED, not neon. I mean, I, as the neon advocate, would say that neon is significant enough in its own right that if you've got a sign that is being treated as a landmark or a contributing part of a landmark, and it's neon, neon is the historic material, like terracotta is the historic material that, you know, is sort of critical to the essence of what this thing is. The Apollo Theater marquee is just got permission yesterday, I believe, to be switched over from neon to LED. And it'll be a subtle change that probably most people won't even notice, but it is happening with the blessing of the Landmarks Commission. So that's the situation we have.
Holly asks if automat signs were neon.
Automat signs were definitely neon. Automats go back before neon, so their earliest signs were incandescent signs. But automats, I regard automats as being a sort of a genre of cafeterias more broadly, and cafeterias and neon went together hand in hand. And so you'll see old street photographs of New York with cafeteria storefronts, always neon. And automats were part and parcel of that. So yes, the automat, de rigueur, neon at every single automat. I don't think there's a single surviving neon automat sign from New York City that I know of. The same collector that had the Jade Mountain sign the same night showed me an automat sign that they had managed to get from Philadelphia, which is where the Horn and Harder chain had originated. So that was the same kind of a sign. There was a surviving automat sign in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn, just off Fulton Street, that was around long enough for me to photograph it as a sort of husk, but that has unfortunately disappeared in recent years. So I don't know of a single surviving automat sign. That's the long answer. The short answer is yes, automats and neon, absolutely. And Katz's is maybe the best place to get a sense for that, because Katz's, though it's a delicatessen, is kind of a cafeteria delicatessen. And Katz is just splashed with neon everywhere. So you can get that experience. Probably the closest you could come to getting that experience now. Sorry.
We have an anonymous attendee who asked, I'm not sure if I understand this, but maybe you will. The other movie reference is Butches Who Got a New Neon Sign During the War and Best Years of Our Lives, proudly stated by the character who lost his hands.
Yes, that's a great one. Yeah, the film The Best Years of Our Lives, which is one of the best films in the history of cinema, I think in some official appraisal. There's a split-second scene in that movie that I have caught where, yes, after the war, they got a new neon sign.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you, Tom. That was really absolutely phenomenal. And I'm always wowed by your presentations and your walking tours, and this one is no exception. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And for those of you who missed some or all of tonight's presentation, it will be posted on our YouTube channel, along with other past webinars we've presented. You can find our YouTube channel by searching Lesby NYC YouTube, or finding the link symbol at the bottom of your invitation to this event. The video should be up in about a week. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll get notification when this video and future webinars are posted. You can keep an eye out For other future Lesby events as well, we have both live and virtual lectures, book talks, and walking tours. To keep up with what we're doing at any given time, as well as keeping up with other Lower East Side preservation news and information, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then finally, please consider making a donation to Lesby today if you can. We need donations to help us to continue to produce webinars such as this one and to continue our advocacy work for Lower East Side landmarking. You can find a donate button on your original invitation to this event and at the website shown here. So thank you again, Tom and Helena, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending, and everybody have a good night.